When the Archangel Michael came to collect Abraham's soul, the friend of God did something no mortal had ever dared before him. He simply said, no. Not fear, not defiance for its own sake, but a quiet, immovable refusal that would force even heaven itself to negotiate. God had watched Abraham grow old across 200 years of righteous life, and now, seeing his faithful servant approaching the natural end of his days, decided to send Michael to prepare him gently for what was coming. Not with terror, not with the sudden violence of ordinary death, but with dignity befitting a man who had once argued with God himself over the fate of Sodom. Michael descended to the oak of Mamre in the guise of a magnificent commander, radiant and terrible in his beauty, and found Abraham resting beneath the very tree where he had once entertained 3 heavenly visitors decades before. "Abraham," Michael said, his voice carrying an authority that made the ground itself seem to still around him. "The time has come for you to leave this world and go to the Lord." Abraham looked upon this glorious stranger and, ever the gracious host even now, invited him to rest, to eat, to enjoy the hospitality that had made his name legendary across the land. Michael accepted, though he ate nothing. And as they spoke together beneath the ancient oak, Abraham slowly began to understand exactly who his guest truly was and precisely why he had come. "I know why you are here," Abraham finally said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he now understood. "But I will not go with you." Michael, startled by a response he had never once encountered in all his centuries of service, found himself at a genuine loss, uncertain how to proceed against the simple, unshakable will of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to bend to lesser demands than this one. Rather than force compliance, rather than strike down this ancient patriarch as duty might have suggested, Michael did something unprecedented. He ascended back to heaven to ask God directly what should be done with a man righteous enough and stubborn enough to say no to death itself. God listened to Michael's report with something that might have been amusement mixed with genuine respect, understanding immediately that ordinary force would never work against a will as firm as Abraham's. "Go back to my friend," God instructed, "and tell him whatever he wishes to see. Show him so that he might understand there is no escape from what is coming, and let him then choose willingly to come with you, rather than face what would happen should I be forced to send death itself to claim what mercy would have otherwise made gentle." Michael returned from heaven, carrying an offer that would test the very limits of what Abraham could bear to witness. Not force, not compulsion, but a bargain fit for a man who had negotiated with God himself over the fate of entire cities. "The Lord says this," Michael told him, "whatever you wish to see before you depart this life, that I will show you, so that you may go willingly rather than being taken by force." Abraham, hearing this, felt something stir in him that had nothing to do with fear of death and everything to do with a lifetime of curiosity he had never dared voice aloud. "There is one thing I have always wished to see," Abraham said, slowly, "before my eyes close upon this world forever. I wish to see the whole of the inhabited earth, all at once, while I still draw breath." Michael, though startled by the vastness of the request, could not refuse a wish so freely granted by God himself. And so he commanded a great chariot of fire to descend from the clouds, its wheels wreathed in flame that did not burn, its frame more magnificent than anything Abraham's mortal eyes had ever beheld. Abraham mounted the chariot beside Michael, and as it lifted from the earth, he watched his own camp at Mamre shrink beneath him until it disappeared entirely into the vast patchwork of the world, spreading out in every direction. Rivers he had never seen unwound like silver threads across the land. Cities he had never visited clustered together like scattered jewels. Deserts stretched in golden expanses he had only ever imagined in stories told by traveling merchants. For the first time in 200 years of life, Abraham understood the true scale of the world God had created, and something in him ached at the beauty of it, knowing he would soon leave it behind forever. But as the chariot carried him higher and further, Abraham's eyes began to catch sight of something else entirely. Men and women engaged in every manner of wickedness scattered across the earth below. Thieves breaking into houses under cover of darkness. murderers striking down the innocent for coin or spite, men committing acts of violence against women who had no power to resist them. Abraham, righteous man that he was, found his heart filling with a rage he had never before experienced with such intensity, watching helplessly from his impossible vantage point as sin after sin unfolded beneath him without any earthly consequence in sight. "Lord," Abraham called out, unable to contain himself any longer, "let the earth open its mouth and swallow these people who do such wickedness before my very eyes." And to his shock, the moment the words left his lips, the ground below tore open exactly as he had demanded, and those he had condemned with a single furious wish vanished into the earth, exactly as though his righteous anger alone carried the weight of divine judgment itself. The Lord's voice descended upon Michael before the chariot had even finished its terrible work, and it carried a weight of rebuke that Michael had never heard directed at a mortal man before. "Command the chariot to halt," God said, "and turn it back toward Abraham's tent, for I fear that if I allow him to see the whole of the inhabited earth, he shall condemn every sinner upon it, leaving nothing behind but ash and empty ground. Behold, Abraham has not sinned, and he has no mercy on sinners. But I made the world, and I do not wish to destroy any one of my creatures. Instead, I wait patiently for a man's death, in case he should repent and turn back to me." Michael turned to Abraham, his radiant face touched with something between compassion and warning, and relayed the Lord's words exactly as he had received them. Watching Abraham's expression shift from righteous satisfaction to a dawning, uncomfortable understanding, Abraham said nothing for a long while as the chariot leveled out and began to descend toward a vast golden gate suspended between two paths, one narrow and choked with thorns, the other broad and paved smooth as glass, and Abraham could see multitudes of souls pressing through the broad gate, while only a scattered few struggled through the narrow one. Beyond the gates stood a throne of terrible brilliance, and upon it sat a judge whose face bore the calm sorrow of a man who has witnessed every sin humanity could commit, weighing soul after soul in a set of golden scales, while two recording angels stood at his sides, one writing down every righteous deed a soul had performed, and the other marking down every transgression in a book bound with iron. "Who is this radiant judge?" Abraham asked Michael. And Michael answered that this was Abel, son of the first man, set to judge humanity in its first trial before the greater judgment to come at the end of all things. For God had granted him this honor since Abel himself had been the first to suffer death unjustly at his brother's hand. Abraham watched as soul after soul was weighed on the scales, some sinking heavy with wickedness toward the fire that waited below, others rising light and radiant toward the gate of paradise. And something in him began to soften as he understood the terrible burden Abel carried in judging fairly. Then Abraham's eyes fell upon a single soul standing trembling before the scales. And when the recording angels tallied the deeds, they found the sins and the righteous acts weighed exactly equal, not one grain tipping the balance in either direction, so that the soul stood frozen between salvation and ruin, while the angels themselves seemed uncertain what judgment to render. Abraham felt his heart move with a compassion he had not known he still possessed after his fury over the sinners on earth, and he turned to Michael. "What becomes of a soul whose sins and virtues balance so perfectly?" he asked, and something in his own voice trembled. For he understood, perhaps for the first time, that judgment was far heavier a burden than he had ever imagined when he called down fire upon strangers from the safety of his flying chariot. Michael studied the frozen, trembling soul for a long moment before answering Abraham's question, his voice gentle but heavy with the weight of divine law. "Such a soul is neither condemned nor saved," he said, "for its sins and its righteousness stand in perfect balance, and so it must wait here between the scales until the great and final judgment comes upon all the world. Only then will its fate be decided, and until that day it can neither enter paradise nor descend to punishment, but must remain suspended in this place, forgotten by both mercy and wrath alike. Abraham felt something twist painfully in his chest at these words, for he thought of all the years this soul might wait alone in the space between salvation and ruin. And the thought seemed to him a cruelty greater than any fire below. Is there truly nothing that can be done for it? Abraham asked. And Michael, watching the old man's face carefully, answered that there was one thing. The fervent prayer of a righteous man could tip such a balance, for God listened closely to those who pleaded on behalf of souls too weak to plead for themselves. Abraham did not hesitate. He fell to his knees upon the very air itself, before the throne of judgment, and lifted his voice toward the blinding light above Abel's seat, begging that this one soul, caught between two fates through no greater fault than the ordinary weakness of a mortal life, be shown mercy and drawn upward into the light, rather than left to hang forgotten between worlds. Michael knelt beside him and added his own voice to the prayer, and for a moment the whole of that vast judgment hall fell utterly silent, as though creation itself was holding its breath to see what would happen. Then, slowly, the golden scales began to shift. The righteous side sank lower, weighted now by something unseen and immeasurable, while the darker pan rose gently upward, and the trembling soul let out a sound that was neither weeping nor laughter, but something achingly close to both, before rising in a shaft of soft white light through the gate and vanishing into the radiance beyond. Abel himself looked up at Abraham with an expression of quiet astonishment, as though he had witnessed something even he, judge of all humanity's first trial, had rarely seen. A soul saved not by its own deeds, but by the compassion of another. Abraham rose to his feet, and for the first time since he had cursed the sinners upon the earth and watched the ground swallow them whole, he understood the full weight of what he had done. I see now, he said quietly to Michael, that my anger condemned men without offering them what I have just offered this single soul, the chance for mercy to intervene where judgment alone would destroy. Michael said nothing, but the look he gave Abraham carried something like relief, as though the lesson God had intended all along had finally taken root. The chariot began its slow descent then, carrying them back toward the green hills and the great oak of Mamre, back toward Abraham's tent and the ordinary world he had left behind, though neither of them yet knew that death himself was already waiting there, patient and unseen for Abraham's return. The chariot descended through the golden afternoon light exactly where it had risen, and Abraham found himself once more standing beneath the great oak at Mamre, his sandals sinking into the same soft earth he had left behind, though something in him felt permanently changed by all he had witnessed above. Michael turned to him then, his radiant face touched with something gentler than before. You have seen what you asked to see, Michael said. The breadth of the inhabited world, and more besides, the judgment that awaits every soul, and the mercy that can still intervene even there. Now, Abraham, the time has come to make ready, for your days upon this earth are finished, and death itself waits to receive your spirit. Abraham felt the old fear rise in him again, sharper now for having tasted the vastness of life and beauty he was about to lose, and he began once more to protest, insisting he was not yet prepared, that there must be some further delay, some final mercy still to be granted. But even as he spoke, Michael's form began to shimmer and fade, called back to the halls of heaven, leaving Abraham alone beneath the ancient branches, with only the fading warmth of divine light lingering where the angel had stood. And it was in that very silence, broken only by the rustle of oak leaves in the evening wind, that a stranger appeared upon the path leading up from the valley below, walking with unhurried, deliberate steps toward Abraham's tent. The figure was cloaked in radiant splendor, unlike anything Abraham had seen, even in his heavenly journey. Golden light seemed to pour from beneath the folds of the traveler's robes. And yet beneath that borrowed magnificence, Abraham's ancient instincts stirred with a dread he could not quite name, an unease that settled cold in his stomach, despite the beauty before him. "Peace be with you, Abraham," the stranger said, his voice smooth and pleasant, carrying no hint of the terror that name should have carried. "I have come from a far country, and I have heard of your great hospitality toward travelers. So I have come to receive it as so many others have before me." Abraham, ever the gracious host even in his exhaustion, rose and welcomed the visitor as he would any weary traveler, calling for water to wash his feet and inviting him beneath the shade of the oak to rest, never once suspecting that the beauty standing before him was Death himself, wearing splendor as a mask to hide the truth of what waited beneath, a truth that Michael, watching unseen from beyond the veil, understood far better than the trusting old man, now offering bread and wine to his own end. Abraham led his radiant guest beneath the oak with the same unhurried courtesy he had shown 1,000 travelers before. And Sarah, seeing the stranger's magnificence from a distance, hurried to prepare the finest meal their tent could offer, though something in her too felt an unease she could not name as she watched him settle onto the stone bench beside her husband. The bread was warm, the wine poured freely, and yet Abraham noticed, with the sharp attentiveness of a man who had entertained angels before, that his guest did not eat. The stranger lifted the bread to his lips again and again, made every motion of a hungry traveler enjoying a gracious host's table, and yet not a single crumb ever passed into his mouth, not a single drop of wine ever seemed to vanish from his cup, though he smiled and praised the meal as though he savored every bite of it. Abraham said nothing at first, turning the strange observation over in his mind as the evening deepened around them, the campfire crackling nearby and casting flickering shadows that seemed disturbingly to bend away from the stranger rather than fall naturally across his golden robes. He watched the visitor's hands more closely now, noticing how his fingers, though shaped like any man's, seemed to blur faintly at the edges whenever the firelight struck them at a certain angle, as though the beauty covering him were a garment stretched a little too thin over something far less pleasant beneath. A cold unease settled into Abraham's chest, the same feeling a man gets when he realizes, too late, that the path he has been walking has quietly become unfamiliar ground. "Tell me, honored guest," Abraham said carefully, keeping his voice as warm and hospitable as ever, though his eyes had grown sharp with suspicion. "From what land do you come, and by what name should I address you, that I might properly honor you before my household?" The stranger's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of ancient patience mixed with something almost like reluctant respect for the old man's perception. "I have many names among many peoples," the stranger answered smoothly, "though perhaps it would serve us both better if I simply continued to enjoy your hospitality a while longer before troubling you with such matters." But Abraham, who had negotiated with God himself over the fate of cities and had just returned from witnessing the very throne of judgment, was not a man easily deflected by pleasant evasions. "I have shown you every courtesy a stranger could ask," Abraham pressed, his voice steady but firm, "and I ask only this in return. Show me your true form, exactly as you were created, hiding nothing behind this borrowed splendor. I have looked upon the chariots of heaven and the scales of judgment this very day, and I do not believe there is any sight left in this world or the next that could frighten an old man who has seen what I have seen." The stranger studied him for a long, silent moment, the firelight dancing strangely across a face that no longer seemed quite so warm, and at last he set down the untouched bread in his hand. "You ask a dangerous thing, Abraham," the visitor said, his pleasant voice now carrying an undertone like distant thunder. "For no mortal eyes have looked upon what I truly am and lived to speak of it afterward. But since you insist, and since I have rarely met a man bold enough to make such a request of me directly, I shall grant your wish." The stranger rose from the stone bench, and as he did, the golden robes that had cloaked him since his arrival began to peel away like smoke caught in a rising wind, revealing not skin and bone beneath, but something that made Abraham's blood run cold in his ancient veins. 2 enormous heads, one wreathed in flame and one drowning in shadow, growing from a single writhing form, more terrible than anything the fiery chariot or the throne of judgment had prepared him to witness. 7 fiery serpent heads coiled where a normal man's hair should have been, and a vast swirling darkness pulsed beneath a countenance of such crushing dread that the very oak above them seemed to shrink back from its branches, leaves curling black at the edges as though scorched by a heat that gave no warmth. Abraham, who had negotiated with the Almighty over the fate of Sodom and had just returned from witnessing scales that weighed the souls of all humanity, felt his courage shatter completely for the first time in 200 years of life. He fell backward from his seat, his old limbs failing him entirely, and darkness swallowed his vision as his spirit fled his body in sheer overwhelming terror, leaving him crumpled and lifeless upon the very ground where moments before he had offered bread and wine to his own destroyer. Death himself, seeing what his true form had wrought upon even so righteous and courageous a man, felt something almost like regret stir within his terrible nature, for he had shown mercy in restraining his fullest horror, and still it had been enough to stop an old man's heart. Death called out toward the heavens then, his voice no longer smooth and pleasant, but layered with the grue of 1,000 dying breaths, all speaking at once. "Michael," he called, "come and see what your Abraham has demanded of me, and witness that I have already shown him more gentleness than any mortal before him has received. For I did not even reveal my fullest and most terrible countenance, and still his spirit could not endure the sight." Michael descended in a shaft of light, kneeling beside Abraham's fallen body with visible sorrow, and together the Archangel and Death himself worked to gently restore breath to the old man's chest, coaxing his frightened spirit back into the vessel it had so violently abandoned, for it was not yet God's will that Abraham's story should end in such an undignified and terrifying collapse beneath his own beloved oak tree. Abraham's spirit returned to his body slowly, like a man surfacing from the bottom of a deep, cold lake. And when his eyes finally opened again, he found himself gazing up not at the monstrous form that had stopped his heart, but at the same gentle traveler's face that had first arrived at his tent, golden and composed once more, sitting patiently beside him as though nothing terrible had happened at all. Michael knelt on his other side, relief plain upon his radiant features, and Abraham, his voice trembling from the memory of what he had glimpsed, could only ask, in a whisper hoarse with lingering horror, whether the stranger intended to show him such a sight again before the end finally came for him. "I showed you only a portion of my truest form," Death admitted quietly, "for I feared, rightly as it turns out, that the fullest measure of what I am would shatter you beyond any hope of restoration. Be at peace, Abraham. I have no wish to torment a righteous man in his final hour, and I did not come to force your soul from you through cruelty or violence." Abraham, still weak and trembling upon the ground beneath the oak, found himself studying this being who had so terrified him only moments before. And something in Death's manner now seemed almost sorrowful, as though the burden of ending every human life that had ever been lived weighed upon him more heavily than Abraham had ever imagined a creature of pure dread might feel. "Then tell me," Abraham said, gathering the last of his courage, "is there truly no way for a soul to leave its body without suffering as I have just suffered, without such terror as I have just endured?" Death considered the question for a long moment, and something almost like compassion flickered behind his composed features. "For the righteous," he said slowly, "there is a gentler way, one I rarely have cause to use, since so few men die with hearts prepared enough to receive it peacefully. If you wish, Abraham, you need only extend your hand to me, and I shall take your soul as gently as a man draws a single hair from a bowl of fresh milk, without pain, without terror, so swiftly you shall scarcely know the moment it happens." Abraham, exhausted by fear and heavenly wonder alike, and trusting now in something he could not fully name, extended his trembling hand toward Death, who took it not with claws or shadow, but with a touch as soft and warm as any mortal's, pressing his lips gently to the back of Abraham's aged hand in a gesture of solemn, almost tender farewell. And in that single instant, Abraham's soul slipped free from his body as easily and painlessly as morning mist lifting from a quiet field, leaving behind only an old man's peaceful, unmarked form resting beneath the great oak of Mamre, his face at last untroubled by fear, wonder, or grief. Michael gathered the departed soul in a fold of radiant light, and together with a great chorus of angels descending to honor the friend of God, they bore Abraham upward through the opening heavens, past the very gates and scales he had witnessed only days before, carrying him not to judgment, but directly into paradise itself, where the patriarch, who had once negotiated boldly with God over the fate of cities, now took his place among the righteous. His story complete, his testament sealed. The man who had learned, in the end, that even death could be gentle to those who had first learned to be merciful themselves.